Ladies and gents at the back, are you sitting down? Are you going? No? You have to sit down. The president says sit down. Okay, so we come to our last session of the day, and can I tell you, it's a top session. It really is. You see, what are they like? They're just thinking, is she talking about us? I absolutely am. So let me introduce this session, which comes from SAPEA. You have there, and their names are all out there, Julia Carlini, Nicole Gruber, Dilyana Mihalova, and Sabina Pal. Now, they represent all a different group. So I'm delighted to say Julia is a lawyer who has come rushing to us. I mean, literally rushing to us. She's an attorney at the Centre for International Environmental Law in Geneva, and she is actually involved in the conference of the parties to the Basel Convention to negotiate regulation on plastic waste. So she has been negotiating, and she's going to go back to Geneva this evening because they have night negotiating sessions. So how impressed are you that she's come rushing here? And just, Julia, just tell us a bit about, because we'll get the inside track here. We better not tweet this, by the way. So how is it going?
Oh, hello. It's going well. We are looking forward to arriving to tomorrow, which is the last day of the Conference of the Parties. And countries are actually negotiating how to categorize plastic waste, because right now they're free of trading plastic waste, as you know, it didn't pose any problem, and that's why we see especially Southeast Asian countries flooding with plastic waste. And there are several proposals and a lot of interest, and right now parties are meeting in private to try to negotiate a final text that hopefully tonight at a night session we will reach consensus on. Well, they will reach consensus on, because I'm part of the observers, so countries are negotiating and we as civil society can observe and comment on and try to help them, but it's up to political decisions.
Fantastic. Now, let me introduce Nicole Gruber. So Nicole, who I have to say now, was in a program that the UK does called Crucible, which is all disciplines of researchers, early career researchers together. And she was in our second intake, and it's to identify superstars. And she has proved to be exactly that thing. So Nicole is now Professor of Nanomaterials at Oxford. She's blushing, I don't know why. Tell us a bit about SAPEA, because this is, so we've come now to the scientist here in the plastics field.
Is this on?
Yeah.
SAPEA, perhaps I'd tell you a little bit about how I got here, and then about SAPEA. So how did I get here? We had earlier in the discussion with the Global Young Academy, and we talked about the importance of young scientists contributing to science in general, but also science policy. And I'm sitting here as one of the seven chief scientific advisors, because the Young Academy of Europe, who had the goal to influence science policy from a younger perspective, nominated me for this role. So in that sense, they are contributing. And as a chief scientific advisor to the European Commission, we're 7, and we collaborate very closely with SAPEA, which is the European network that is basically gathering scientific evidence on which we base our recommendations. And also, very importantly, we also collaborate with the SAM, Science Advice Mechanism Unit, based at Brussels. So it's this symbiotically working triumvirate that is absolutely essential. And what was your question?
Well, I think you told us. Okay,
thank you.
So, Dilyana, so now we come to, so lawyer, scientist, NGO, because we're all looking at the things that go into scientific advice. So Dilyana, tell us about yourself and what you do.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Hi. Yes, so I work for an NGO called Fauna and Flora International. That's an international biodiversity conservation group based in Cambridge, but we work in over 40 countries. And I'm marine plastics projects manager, and I've been in this field for quite a while. I did my dissertation on microplastics in the ocean, and I've been with FFI for about 5 years. And we were one of the first international organizations to start working on the issue of microplastics and to address direct sources, because we took the precautionary principle back in 2009. And that has taken us in all kinds of places. We've worked with a lot of businesses on voluntary commitments. We were really involved in the development of the UK microbeads ban. And we're very much evidence-based. We work with science quite a lot. And a lot of the lessons we've learned from developing the UK microbeads ban, we're now applying to many other types and sources of plastic pollution. So it's a very techie role. I am a scientist by background, as I said, but at the same time, it's translating that science evidence for many different audiences and trying to use it to drive positive change and create solutions that are effective in the long term. And just a bit more about FFI, in case that's useful background. We work through long-term projects. We're not a campaigning organization. But we do partner with many different organizations because we see how the roles that different parts of civil societies play can really benefit each other and be really complementary. I think that's probably, I'm going to stop talking now.
And I'm going to add that she was also very much involved in the UK ban on microbeads. Okay, now, the final member of our panel is somebody that perhaps you wouldn't have found on a panel like this, maybe even 5 years ago. Sabina Powell is a psychologist, but working in public areas. So just tell us what you do.
Yeah, I'm a psychologist, trained as a psychologist. I've always been in a school of psychology, but when I talk to interdisciplinary audiences, I actually call myself a behavioral scientist, because that's really what I'm interested in. So this is one of the many environmental challenges that we face, and the key thing is that it's the human dimension that's important. We need to understand why people make these decisions, for example, adding microbeads to cosmetics. Who thought that was a good idea? And what are consumer decisions and behaviors, and how can we change those? So it's a whole array of science that I want to bring to these areas, from risk perception to risk communication to behavior change. And that's been my role, not just in plastic, but also in things like energy demand, other types of pollution, and so on. But that's why I'm here as a psychologist. I'm not a clinical psychologist. I know nothing about depression, etc. I'm here as a behavioral scientist.
So fascinating. So a top team here. Okay, so we're talking about microplastics, and one of the things that has been evident to the whole world are the problems of plastics in oceans. And as we speak, the ghost of David Attenborough is hovering above. But Blue Planet, and we were talking earlier about images, the images, of a turtle with a plastic bag around it, whales on a beach with 40 pounds of plastic bags in their stomachs. Those things have played a really major part in public consciousness. And let me start with Sabina. Why do you think that plastics has been catapulted to the top of the science agenda in this way?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So plastics, the material has only been around for something like 60 years. And when you think about it, the trajectory it's taken and where we find it now and what we know about, not just big pieces of plastic, but also microplastics, smaller pieces, it's been amazing, given that it's such a novel material. And I think it's a combination of unique features that mean it's so in the public domain now. One is it's quite visible. If we talk about larger pieces of plastic, even smaller pieces of plastic, if they're not at the very micro level or the nano level, we can assess for ourselves. So people go to beautiful beaches and they see this litter being washed up, and they maybe encounter a seal like you've described, and it's just awful to them. It really conflicts with their values, with their love of nature and so on. So it's a problem that you can assess for yourself, that you can really think about, and it makes you sad. We've got these emotional reactions in people, and that can motivate action. That's one side of it. The other side of it is the policymakers are telling us they actually like this problem, it's easier than some of the other things they're facing. For example, climate change is more murky, it's more difficult, there's denial and so on. So they actually say, we like doing something about plastic because we don't get hammered by everyone. There's no political polarization for plastic that we've seen for climate change. So it's a very unique issue that we're in a situation at the moment, there's real momentum. People want to do something about it. And we can use that momentum to go forward. So it's that aspect of it.
Although interesting that you say about denial, because the denial that I think that we're beginning to see in Europe, there's a bit of, yes, plastics is a big problem, but we're not the big real offenders. Just look at China, just look at Southeast Asia. So that's a coming issue, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, if you think about psychology, that's a very common issue. If you do something wrong, it's not you, it's someone else. If you do something right, it's, you know, success has many fathers, as they say, not mothers for some reason. So that also applies here. But we haven't got the same issue as in climate change, where people say, you know, it's not really happening, it's natural variation. It's some lobbyists that are coming up with these ideas about climate change. We haven't seen that at all in plastic, and that's what makes it a slightly easier problem to address, I think. Although actually addressing it is also hugely complicated, because we've got these many-fold materials in so many different contexts that it's actually very difficult to address the overall plastic issue. We've had some great successes, but there's still
And
lots
it's
to
very
do.
handy that a lot of plastic is date stamped. So people have been outraged to find crisp packets that have endured for 20 years washing around in the oceans. And that's a very real example of the enduring nature of crisp packets and plastics. I want to come to Nicole, though. Why do you think the EU has been so keen? I mean, we've heard a bit from Sabina about it not being such a wicked problem as climate change. But what's made the European Commission just really take hold of this?
Well, in a way, it's low-hanging fruit. On the one hand, there is this massive uncertainty about what microplastics are or how to identify them in the environment, whether it's in, well, we heard the oceans, the sea, the David Attenborough is sort of the typical example. We have the macroplastics, then decaying into the microplastics. We differentiate between intentional and unintentional microplastics. But it's something
Sorry,
that is...
just enlarge on that. Intentional and unintentional.
Okay, so we heard about the facial wash and all these intentionally added microplastics to beautify us even more. I don't know why that's really necessary, but so these are the intentionally added ones by industry, and then plastic bottles such as these, or the macroplastics that disintegrate over time, exposed to the environment, into smaller and smaller pieces until it reaches the micrometer level, which in the community starts from 5 millimeters and below. And once we reach the nanometer level, we talk about nanoplastics, and those are even more difficult to identify in the environment, whether it be the ocean, the soil, or the air. And there is some evidence that it has been found everywhere in all of, sort of, in the entire environment.
Okay, so SAPEA then produced this, and you've got a summary on your tables on microplastics. Just give us the main findings.
Of the SAPEA report, I have to pass on to Sabina.
This is a complicated process, as we've learned. So in the SAPEA report, our main conclusion was that at the moment, there is not widespread risks to the environment or to humans. And that's because there isn't much evidence for microplastics in the field. So the methods are developing. There are certain pockets of evidence where we are concerned, but actually the evidence is not there at the moment. So that was the overall conclusion, which I think came as a surprise to some people. But we had to say this because we looked at the published evidence, and that was all we could conclude there.
Could I stop
Yes.
you there? Because that's, I think, a prime example on how this whole advice mechanism works. And so this is the microplastics evidence report, which looks at the science that's out there and summarizes in a very comprehensive matter of what we know, what we don't know, and what we need to look into. You have the color coding, it's really good.
And to summarize, there's an awful lot that we don't know.
There's an awful lot that we don't know. And based on this, the chief scientific advisors have produced this opinion paper where we make certain recommendations, and amongst which there are 3. And the one that Sabine was just mentioning about the uncertainty, we're suggesting to look at the existing policy cover, see if this can be broadened to apply, for example, to the Water Framework Directive, look at the sludge composition or fertilizers, air quality, see if is the legislation fit for purpose now, or does it need tweaking, or do we need to go even further and come up with new solutions?
Okay, let me go to Julia. So there's the lawyer. There's a lot that is not known. So how do you get the big corporations to get into this when they could actually quite properly turn around and say, look, folks, there's not the evidence here?
That's what they're trying to do, not only on plastic, but on a lot of other issues. And I mainly work on chemicals, and we've seen that, like with certain chemicals, certain pesticides. Science has been manipulated, and the fact that a scientist doesn't really come to policymakers saying, I have 100% evidence that this is the fact, but you could ask, can we do some more research? And probably they will always reply, yes, we can. This has been manipulated in a way that, corporate interest can say there's not enough science. And so the answer that we should receive, and I think when we're communicating from science to policy we should use, is that there is enough science to act and use the precautionary principle, because otherwise we will keep waiting and waiting and waiting and say that we need more evidence, and then, let the years pass and we don't have enough time. We don't have that time.
Nicole.
Yeah, I'd like to just follow up again with the opinion. So we also addressed this particular issue, and one thing is that we looked at the risk, the highest potential risk are the materials that are most out there. So try and reduce, reuse, and recycle these plastic materials in order to mitigate any potential risk that are currently not widespread, but the report, the Microplastics report, SAPEA report also showed if we continue at this rate, there'll be probably disaster striking in at least in a few tens or hundreds years.
Let me just go to first to Diliana, because there's an issue, I guess, if you are an NGO, because an NGO, you want to ramp up the ante all the time, and the fact that there isn't any evidence is not that helpful to an NGO. I appreciate that FFI are not our campaigner in this sense, but if you're Greenpeace, you're a bit disappointed if something comes up and says there's no evidence, because you really, want there to be something that you can campaign about.
I think, and please correct me if that's not the correct interpretation, I think there's a lot of uncertainty, but it's not the case that there's not enough evidence, because there was this initial evidence back in 2009 that prompted us to take the precautionary principle, and it really is, there's a lot that we don't know, but even the little that we know, it's actually very meaningful, and it was game-changing years ago. And I think I would also like to clarify that with these reports, we look at ecological risk, population level, ecosystem level impacts. These normally take more than 20 years to establish in any science with any pollutant. With plastics, it's a very unique pollutant. It is challenging our traditional frameworks of doing ecotoxicology research and making decisions based on that, because we don't have any background concentrations to compare that to. We don't have control systems, because most of the animals that we sample, they already have plastic in their system. And at the same time, we do have these the limited pockets of evidence that Sabine was talking about that show that in laboratory experiments, yes, sometimes high concentrations, sometimes lower concentrations, there is evidence that shows that animals at the bottom of the food chain are eating these tiny pieces of plastics, and they can pass them up the food chain, and there are the chemicals associated with these plastics. And that's enough cause for concern. And even if with microplastics, it's hard to relate to. I think, we've all seen these images of seabirds with stomachs full of plastic. And even if we cannot have the science right now to show that this plastic was the cause of the death of that seabird, even, a simple look at that, that this cannot be good for the animal. And there is a scientist, Jan van Frannek in the Netherlands, who does this analogy where he takes the plastic from the amount of plastic that he finds in a seabird's stomach, and he translates that into what this would mean for a human being to eat the same amount of plastic proportionate to our body sizes, and it's something like 2 kilograms. So even if we don't have this exact evidence that says this is the kind of chemical that leaked from this type of plastic, or there was like a rupture in the intestine from this specific toothbrush that the seabird ate, we already know that it cannot be good for it. And we see that, as you say, it's an exponential growth in the production of plastic and also in the plastic that we leak into the environment. So I think there's so much that we can take and use the precautionary principle on that. Yes, there is uncertainty, but that's not what we're focusing on, because there's so much else that we need to focus on. It's kind of screaming in our faces.
So Sabina, is this really helpful in terms of the psychology of it? I mean, the idea that we wash our fleece, that we go outdoors because it's healthy and in the environment, and then there are microfibers, and that we're eating mussels that are full of microfibers. The Belgians must be full of them.
Well, actually, there was a study that extrapolated intake of microfibers, microplastics from mussels, and it was very small. But anyway,
it's all right, Belgians, you're all right.
Coming back to the question of psychology, I think it's interesting because what you're describing clearly, there's cause for concern for the general public, and that's why we've seen this outcry. So it's interesting because during the SAPEA process, we had lots of discussions around the question, is there too much focus on plastic now? And there are actually other problems, climate change, biodiversity, we've just heard about this week, which of course could be linked. But does it actually take attention away from all these other issues? And how do we prioritize? Because maybe it's a slightly easier problem, maybe people can relate to it and so on. So I think that's an unresolved question that's really important to ask. But I'm not answering your question, I know.
Julia.
I think you were before me.
Are you sure? Yeah. Okay, just to add to this point, I think it's a really good point. And earlier when we were discussing climate deniers, and we don't have it in the plastics field, I think they're plastic skeptics, where you feel like there's more important issues to focus on. And from the way I see it, I think all of this momentum that we have in the plastics field can so easily be transferred to other issues, because we're making relationships and connections, and businesses are acting on this much more quickly. Even if it's just the Blue Planet 2 effect, we do have this energy. And I think because we're establishing these connections, these multi-stakeholder working group, there's the global governance discussions on plastics. I think there's so many lessons and so many links built that can be applied to other issues. It is my hope, and it's definitely part of what I'm trying to do, is to use that energy for other issues rather than distracting it and trying to hold it in that.
And I think that's
space.
one of the major learnings that we need to take from this whole thing, that it's there's extrapolation to many other areas of science. And it's clear that the public are absolutely behind this. And it's also clear, I think, to manufacturers that there is a big public backlash about this, and that they're not waiting for the legislation, interestingly. I mean, at the moment, I see Bosch is now claiming that it's got a washing machine that takes out the fibres. Does it? Can it? We're not really sure, but it's certainly seeing, advantage in it. Julia?
Yeah, what I wanted to say, commenting on the argument about, taking away the attention from climate change and focusing on plastic, if we look at the source, we can find a lot of commonalities. The challenge is that right now the whole plastic pollution issue is framed as a marine issue and as a waste management issue, and this is very convenient for industry because they propose as a solution to just, manage waste in a better way. And as you mentioned before, it's easy to blame other countries and say, it's not us, it's, in Asia from Asia, all this plastic is leaking. But actually, if we look at where this plastic comes from, which are the major exporters of plastic waste, these are developed countries, not the developing countries. And going even, more at the source is not that plastic comes from nowhere. What's the real source? If we look, go backwards and we go at fossil fuels, then there you have the link with climate change. And if you look at the corporate actors, they are basically the same.
Nicole.
I have no answer, actually. I meant to ask something. Okay, I've been looking at this table here as people were talking, and really interesting things, and I noticed that I'm the only one with these plastic bottles, single-use plastic bottles in front of me, and all my colleagues are very good colleagues because they brought the multi-use or stainless steel. So there's no deny that plastics have caused some problem. We're here to discuss it, but there's also no denying that plastic play a very important role in our lives, and they cannot be just distinguished or removed. So finding plastic alternatives, maybe it's a long-term goal. So we need a multi-pronged approach in terms of looking at where plastics are, how do they get into the environment, human behaviors, train your kids not to just drop the litter is also part of it, in the same way as the multi-global industrialists who produce or add microplastics. So we need a multi-pronged approach in tackling this situation, and also the science needs to collaborate and find out standardization methods to see how we can identify the microplastics or plastics in the oceans, in the soil, in the air, in our environment as a global unit. So it has to be a global cooperation between scientists and politicians, policymakers, NGOs, to tackle this challenge.
And the governments are seeing this actually as an innovation opportunity. I mean, there's a lot of money going into research into plastic alternatives because, as we would say, there's gold in them, their hills. I mean, the person that comes up with a really good alternative for polystyrene, for instance. Anybody from Finland here? You see, you Finns, you're way ahead of us. Finns have got lots and lots of wood-based products that may well do that.
I'll refrain from using one of these bottles. I go later and get it from the tap.
All right. Thank you very much, Nicole. Right.
I would like to add to that. I completely agree, and I think it's a really good point. We actually, at FFI, we call it sensible plastic, because there's definitely so many applications of plastics that you don't want to get rid of. There's a lot of unnecessary applications, but it's definitely, I think the problem is that we don't value plastic and we use it for so many single-use applications that doesn't make any sense. But I think on the alternative side and on the solutions, I think it's really important to distinguish the kind of like real effective long-term solutions, because yes, there's so much momentum now, but there's this opportunity for, really quick announcements of solutions that seem like a really great idea. But I think that's also where the science comes in. We need solutions-based research and science. Yes, there's gaps that need to be filled in terms of the risks, but because we know we've also had groups of scientists coming out publishing, in Nature. We had a paper back in 2015, I think it was, with scientists calling on plastic waste to be classified as hazardous. We had Chelsea Rockman in the US published a science article that says there is enough evidence that suggests that there is a need for microbeads ban. So scientists are themselves taking the precautionary principle. And I think earlier in the session when we said emotion is really important for communicating science, we're definitely seeing that in the plastics world. But it's also now we need science to come in when we talk about innovation, solutions. So many opportunities are coming up, but we need to assess them against like a really good set of criteria, because we are seeing a lot of like false alternatives. And I've looked into a lot of them recently. We're creating like a position paper on that. But I want to say that material substitution is not necessarily the answer. And I think there should be a hierarchy of the way we develop solutions, and a lot more of like changing the infrastructure, the business models, creating this closed loop. That's where we should start. Obviously, we have the unnecessary uses. We have to remove them, phase them out. Then we look at what do we do with essential plastics. We try to close the loop, bring them back into the system, not leak them into the environment. And then the third place there in the hierarchy is then substituting the material to something else. And when we do that, we need to find the right materials, look at all the unintended consequences. And in the middle of all of this, there are all of these questionable gray area alternatives that we call them the plastic-based alternatives, and we hear the biodegradables and bio-based and oxodegradables, and there's so many of them. I think,
but certainly not based on fossil fuels either.
Biodegradable plastics are based on fossil fuels.
Yes.
They can be.
Yes,
Some
yes,
of them can be.
We'd ideally want them based on other things other than fossil fuels.
Well, if they're plastics, if there are plastics, at the moment, they're just as likely to end up in the marine environment as all of the conventional plastics.
Yeah.
And they're very likely to behave in similar ways. So we need to be really, really careful here. And I think there's a danger that these kinds of plastic-based alternatives can be a distraction right now from the actual infrastructural big system change solutions that we need to be developing, where we definitely need science input.
So let me come to our psychologist. So Sabina, this is a really complex problem. The public and politicians, and indeed manufacturers, of consumer goods, are absolutely revving to go. And as Diliana points out, that we can go off completely in the wrong direction. And there's a lot of science we just don't know at the moment. How do we cope with the uncertainty? How do we direct this huge public emotion into the right? And how do we involve the public in those choices?
I think the answer is not to have this knee-jerk reaction where there's, I don't know, one company or someone comes up with a solution and implements it, and we haven't really carefully thought about the unintended consequences on the one hand, and also how it works with people's behaviors and habits and their behavioral practices, because I've seen that particularly in the energy field, actually. There are these technical solutions, and there's what I call techno-optimism, and other people have called techno-optimism, where, we'll have a solution in 5 years' time. We don't need to worry about it at the moment. And then even existing technical solutions have sometimes been implemented with great CO2 savings estimated, and then in reality, they don't work with what people do. And the actual savings have been much, much lower. Now, I haven't got any examples of that yet for plastics, but I'm really worried about it. We really need to think about it in this interdisciplinary context, bring everyone together, because it's a systems challenge. We can't just, there might be one little village who are amazing, who are doing everything, getting rid of all the plastics, but that can't necessarily be scaled up because there are different waste management systems, there are different ways people do things, and so on. So I think that's the thing. We need to have a stepwise approach where we carefully test things in smaller contexts and then think about how that could be embedded in a much larger context. I just wanted to say something about the biodegradables and degradables. I think that's a really, really important issue. Many people are very proud of themselves because they use biodegradable materials and bags and so on. And I'm part of the International Marine Litter Unit at the University of Plymouth. They've just released work this week where they dug up plastic bags that they put in soil. They took them out of the marine environment where they put these things for 3 years. And the degradable plastic bags could still hold a full shopping. So clearly something's not quite working. They might degrade in the natural environment, in the industrial composters or something like that, but in the daily use, or if they escape into the environment, biodegradable materials aren't necessarily what they promise they are. And that's a really important thing to remember. So we need to have that research come together. I still want to also answer your initial question about the psychology, so I can do that later, but...
Oh, no, we love the psychology.
Because what I've seen over the last 10 years or so that I've been involved in this topic is a real change in social norms and in the public discourse. So, I don't know, 5 years ago, anyone who had a reusable bottle or something like that, it would be quite awkward to go to a place, to a cafe and say, oh, can you fill this up for me? You would be looked at, you're a weird greenie or something. These days it's so mainstream, it's almost odd if you're walking around, sorry, Nicole, you're clearly not, but it's almost, it's almost strange if you don't comply with this, particularly in certain contexts like universities and so on. So that's one really interesting thing to see, and it describes the social dynamics underlying societal change, and that's what I find really interesting. How can we encourage that and so on? And just to pick up something else, who moves forward, who makes change happen. There's this thing that's been described as pester power, where actually the children are often the ones that say to the parents and to the grandparents, I've got some very powerful examples where the children go, no, you can't do that, or Grandad, what are you doing? You're using a plastic bag. And there's real change coming from the younger generation. I've been so impressed with things happening there, because we need to change the way we do things, it's very clear.
And we haven't educated them to do that. In other words, they haven't had lessons about plastics. Some have, I guess, but it's something that they've picked up either through social media or television or YouTube. I mean, those channels are very, very important. And I guess also that as scientists, we're going to have to come up with a lot of answers to the questions that people have. So here's a question for you, Nicole. She's looking worried now. So, is it better to have plastic that's tough, strong, and quite expensive and lasts for 10 years, or cheap plastic that has to be replaced every year? I will tell you why I'm asking this.
I'm speechless.
Oh, okay. Okay, Diliana, I'll tell you why I asked this.
well-
I'm having a big argument with one of those companies that makes stuff for hoses, for garden hoses. And they use cheaper and cheaper plastic because they're wanting to sell. What they want is for it to break and for you to have to buy a new one every year. So is it better not to...
Well, where to start? I'd like to
Apart from bimetal.
I would like to revert back to the biodegradable plastics, because that seemed to be the solution, by having biodegradable plastics for your kitchen waste or whatever. But in the end, you still end up with smaller pieces of plastic, just a bit faster than the strong and robust ones. So there are also certain scenarios where scientists just don't know the answer. I would have argued longer life cycle is better. Use, reuse, and recycle must be the answer to combating single-use plastics that you just throw and hope and see what happens. And in this context, we need to take into account the socio-economic context to see if, in a more global picture, industry wants to make money. You mentioned industry. They want to make money, so this is their driving force. They do not want to change their fabrication methods because it's expensive to change your fabrication methods, you change your materials, and it has to be an incentive for them to change. And if longer-term plastic is the solution, then that might be, but science doesn't know the answers to absolutely everything. It is limited within what's currently possible in terms of technologies out there. Characterization methods have their limits. So we have to live with that and then adapt, taking that into account.
So they just have to cope with Mrs. Angry of the Cotswolds writing to them every week saying your product's rubbish. Tiliana.
I think that was a really good example. And I do want to, I think I want to make a point that is very relevant to that example, where you have, the consumer is trying to do the right thing and they're trying to buy the products that they need and they hope that they would last them a long time. I think there is a role for changing consumer behavior, but I think there's too much focus on it right now. Actually, we need to look at the people who hold the main responsibility for the plastics problem, the industry, the policymakers. I think it makes so much sense to have more expensive, durable plastic, but of course, not if that means that not everybody can afford essential things that you need in your daily life. And that's where governments need to make that possible through incentives and creating, opportunities for businesses to use that kind of plastic. But that's the problem, right? We're not valuing plastic. That's why we're not collecting it, we're not using it properly, and it ends up as waste in the environment. But I think there are examples that make that really clear, where it's not about the consumer trying to do something, it's about the people who put these products into our homes, into our daily lives, and how they're designed. So I've brought this really tangible types of microplastics that are pre-production plastic pellets, that literally every plastic object that we have is made from that. That's how they start their lives. You convert oil into these pieces and then you send them to any company that makes these bottles or pens. And these things are really easily spilled because they're really light, and it's like having lentils in your kitchen. They would be all over the floor if you spill them. We find them on beaches all over Europe. We find them in the environment, we find them in animals. We know that they pose a serious concern. They're the second largest direct source of microplastics in the ocean. And this is something that the industry has complete control over. So that's one example where you don't have to go through this diluted responsibility. It's actually the only player and actor that can clean up this is the industry. There's nobody else who is handling them. And that's also part of...
So let me interrupt there and say, Julia, is there a clear case then for the law to step in and regulators and say, the polluter pays, and to really tackle plastics in the same way that you tackle oil pollution or...
Yeah, you already mentioned it. There's the polluter pays principle that should be applied, but
we're not applying it.
We're not applying it, and by we, that's true, as it has just been mentioned, there's a key role for policymakers, because these are big changes, there are systemic changes, so of course, as it has been already mentioned, it will be easier for industries to continue their business as usual, and so they would need incentives, and I see them as a lawyer as regulations, and there's this general reaction about regulations and law, like, oh my God, no, I don't want that because it's such a burden. But we've seen actually how regulations can really help innovation, because then you have, the private sector who has to run and find a solution as soon as possible if they want to keep their profits.
But there's commercial advantage for a lot of companies at the moment in going down a non-plastics route or a recyclable or whatever, because the public at the moment are certainly demanding it. I want to turn to all of you, and I want to turn to a big elephant in the room for me, which is science is a prodigious user of single-use plastics. Prodigious. I mean, I can't speak for other sciences, but for life sciences, we use stuff we just throw it away all the time. Health also. And so there's a great deal of research to be done on whether actually it really does make a difference because sometimes single-use plastics are really important to use. But I suspect a lot of the time they're just convenient to use, which is not really the same thing at all. So anybody here got an idea about how science ought to be seen as leading this fight in plastics? They've gone very quiet. Yeah. So this is Werner Jügster.
Yes, hello. I'm the president of Platform Geoscience of the Swiss Academy of Science. And so as a field scientist, I also use plastics. But I think there are two aspects. One is like many ecologists, they flag things outdoors with plastic bans or flags, these forest flags. There I see the problem that if you leave them for a while so they can refine your plots, that they degrade and they kind of spill over everywhere. Also, bans that you tag to trees, to locations, they deteriorate and go away. But if we collect samples, normally the plastic bag is disposed in an ordinary way, and there I see less of an issue if you have like a controlled recycling system, or at least like a waste burning system. So I think there are two aspects to the question in science.
And can I just note, would you just do stand up again?
Yep.
Do a bit of a twirl, turn around. Can you see he's actually got his mug attached to him?
Yeah, that's something special. So this is a private thing. I'm in chemotherapy right now. This needs a lot of plastic, as you say, in medical sciences. So I'm on a good track, so I can say that. But I have been operated cancer 2 years ago, and so I'm now on the hopefully last stage for getting control over everything. And this uses a lot of plastic. Actually, it's just a time where I could remove that, and it comes in a disposable bag. It is sealed, but it's mostly sealed not because of the plastic, but because of this very toxic material that is in this chemotherapy. So basically, the plastic bag should prevent the remnant droplets to spill in the environment. That's the idea of this plastic here.
Thank you. So it's both a wonder material and a concern. But what I also want to ask you is, here we see an example of an issue in which the public has really pushed policymakers, pushed manufacturers. They've made it something that well, as you said, they've made it normative behavior to carry a recyclable cup rather than to carry a plastic bottle. So how can we apply what we've learned here about science and society to other areas and issues of concern? What can we learn from this? Anybody, any thoughts about that?
So, we've heard a lot through the whole day about scientists talking to people and essentially bringing over what we think is important. But I think what you basically said here is that it's going the other way, right? And I think that's the message, is we need to understand what people actually do care about. And then in some cases, it's something where there's a direct connection with the science, that's fine. And in other cases, it's something where you could find an alignment. So for example, in the United States, where I'm from, there are a lot of climate deniers in the United States. And there are a lot of people who don't care so much about the climate problem. They do care when there's a big flood. They do care when there's a big fire. And if you essentially attack that issue, you say, well, we're really talking about managing natural hazards. How can we do this? What does this take? And essentially, you could perhaps align with exactly the same behavior that you would if you were pushing it from a climate perspective. But you're pushing it from a perspective that people are willing to take up. And I think that's something where science could be more cognizant of what people care about and more thoughtful about how to align what we might consider to be scientifically responsible behavior with what people already care about and are already willing to do. And I think we do not do this. We want people first to agree with us that we're right about what they should care about, and then to do something. And I just think that's a failure.
Yeah, that's a really, really key point, is that we want them to agree with us. And actually, that's not always the way to do it. And, you know, burnt bears or beavers that don't have homes, or I don't know. So, because actually, how important have animals been in this?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent observation, and it's something we also talk about in here, that we need to find out what people care about. And there's some very good research around different frames that you use with people. And in the US, for example, one of the frames for energy, reducing energy and addressing climate change in that way has been the energy independence. You know, we can have our own energy. We don't rely on someone elsewhere. And then people buy into that issue of energy efficiency and so on. Sorry, I was going to say something else. It's gone.
It's all right. It happens. Diliana.
I could add maybe. I think to add to this point, it's I think to understand what people care about, sometimes it can involve a lot of like, you know, you have to really look into that and do the research. But there's also with plastics, I think what we've learned is that there's also a simpler way to look at relatability, because it's not necessarily what you care about. But if there is something like this plastic in a toothpaste that is in your home and you put it on your body every single day, you really relate to that. And when you hear that, you know, this is getting into the animals and you see pictures of that and you understand, oh, actually, my sink is connected to the ocean. I never realized that. It's that like a relatability, like even if you don't immediately care about it, it just kind of like, you know, you cannot unsee it once you start seeing it. They're like these inconspicuous things that feel so intangible. As soon as you realize the tiny blue things in my toothpaste are causing this thing, and then I see it in the Daily Mail and it's on the news, and these seabirds with plastic, and it's a toothbrush that didn't come from a container spill, it could have been from my waste. I think that's when, you know, you really got this issue on the top of the agenda of everybody, even if they don't necessarily care about it or they know they care about it, this relatability to their daily lives and what they're doing and what they're using.
Sabina, you've remembered it.
I have remembered, and it actually links to what you just said. I think there's a fine line for us as scientists, especially on the communication side, between the sort of alarmist message, because what you've just said isn't evidenced in this report. It makes sense, it's logical and so on. But we can't say at the moment, you know, telling people this is credible, because there's no evidence at the moment that actually these particles go into the human body and then they have adverse effects. So that's a difficulty that we have as scientists. But what I was also going to talk about a little bit is the way we communicate. And I work with a lot of natural scientists who are of the opinion that you have to state the facts, and then if the public doesn't understand the facts, you state them again, or you
more
come up with
loudly.
more worse data, and you just throw up your hands in horror and go, they just don't understand me. And that's just not the way. And I know if you're here, you're sort of the enlightened group.
Yes.
But I have had these discussions, and you say, you just need to tell them how bad it is, and then everything's going to change. And that's just not how the public reacts. You have to talk about the values. You have to link it to what they care about. You have to think about what it might challenge and help people with these steps, and not go back to facts time and time again, because you end up in this endless loop.
Can I just tell you one word relating to telling people facts? Brexit. That's all I'm going to say. Sir, and then we'll come to you.
I want to ask the panel about export of plastic waste. I think that's dangerous in two ways. First of all, eventually nothing may be done about it. It just pushes it makes the problem invisible in some parts of the world. And secondly, if there are regulations, so each community and each country deals locally with their waste, then that's another way to confront the problem. I'm wondering if there are actually regulations in place in environmental law internationally in that regard.
Julia.
That is exactly what has been discussed this week in Geneva. So there's an international treaty. It's called the Basel Convention on Transboundary Movement of Hazardous Waste and Other Waste. So as the name suggests, its main focus is about hazardous waste. And so far, this is an international treaty. Almost all countries of the world are parties or ratified this treaty, and so it applies to them. And right now, under this treaty, you can trade plastic and ship it all over the world basically freely, unless it is hazardous, but there are specific conditions for plastic to be considered hazardous. And right now in Geneva, and hopefully we'll have a decision by tomorrow, delegates from countries from all over the world who are parties to the Basel Convention are considering to amend the Basel Convention, thanks to all this pressure, that we have, and try to regulate waste trade, plastic waste trade. And one way would be not to consider all plastic as clean plastic that doesn't fall under any regulation, but try to consider it somehow problematic under the convention. And so put in place a system which is called prior informed consent, where the country who wants to export the plastic waste has to send all the information about the plastic waste, and so the country who can receive it has the means to say, yes, I want this, or I don't want it. Because right now what we're seeing is that a lot of plastic waste has been exported for recycling, or, well, allegedly for recycling, but in reality is mixed waste and it cannot be recycled. And that's actually why China put in place this ban. China was receiving almost half of the waste, the plastic waste. And they recently decided to stop it because it was very low quality. So in reality, they were receiving it where the exporter country was saying this is good for recycling, and in reality it was just being dumped, and then it ended up in the ocean, etc., etc. And yeah, there's a sort of fight right now in Geneva about that, because of course it has economic impacts and it can change the system plastic waste is traded. And under this convention, actually, there is a principle of proximity. So yes, countries should deal with their own waste before sending it abroad, but then it's so easy for rich countries to just ship it and they will always find someone who's receiving it. But we're seeing that after China put in place this ban, then other Southeast Asian countries are also reacting, because plastic waste trade is moving from one country to the other and then just causing problems.
So that's why we're going to feed you out with a lot of coffee and a lot of cakes after this, because you've got to go all through the night. How long do those night sessions last? The whole night?
It depends when countries find an agreement. The way negotiations work actually is they put a text on a screen like this with the amendments that they want to put in place or the decision they want to adopt. And every country has to agree on the text. So they really propose amendments like on commas and different words. And the decision is usually by consensus. Is super rare that countries in this convention call for a vote, because they see themselves or their own sovereignty as so precious that it's almost like a threat to others to call for a vote. So you need everyone to agree, and that's not easy. So there are a lot of compromises and interest, and that's why we're having long nights. So it
put up your
could
hand.
go on all night. We have to finish tomorrow, for sure, and then the next conference of the parties will be in 2 years. So if it nothing is adopted this year. It goes back to 2021.
So put up your hand if you're suddenly very glad you're a scientist and not a lawyer at an international convention. It sounds like torture to me, Nicole.
This morning I learned the person with the microphone has got the power, so I took the microphone. I would like to, unless we're finishing now, but we talked a lot about plastics in the macro sense. Microplastics is a whole new dimension of challenges we need to address. And you see in the discussion that we had, we always revert back to what we know, our plastic bags, our plastic bottles, our reusable ones. This one was mentioned on the side, and this one maybe look even more strange. You tried. But microplastics is a different thing to the macroplastics. And we need to look into that with a new pair of glasses to understand how we can tackle it.
A new pair of very magnified...
powerful glasses.
Powerful glasses. And actually, Nicole, is that a problem or not? So it really matters to you because you are a professor of nanomaterials. So teeny tiny things
the whole
are your field. But for the public, does it matter? It matters. I'm making this point, or I'm stressing it, because actually it's an important one, which is we all want the public to be somehow, to have the knowledge that we have. In other words, to think about plastics. Oh yes, microplastics are a completely different thing to plastics. And yet, is there a danger that insisting that somehow we make them think about it differently, that actually we're undermining our own arguments? Is it really important that they know that microplastics are different from plastics? I mean, I asked that
Is it important to the public? I would say yes, because when you change dimensions of a material, the properties also may change. And if you go down from the macro to the micro to the nano level, it gets harder and harder to identify these particles or plastics or microplastics or nanoplastics. In my personal opinion, is nothing else but yet another material. It's just defined by its size. It can be of any sort of polymer component made of, and each particle will, the properties of each particle will have, the properties of each particle will change depending on their shape, their size, their chemical composition, their surface properties. And having tools to analyze these properties and the behavior or the impact this material can have on the environment is state-of-the-art technology that we only had for a few years. I mean, it's not that long ago that we started seeing atoms or columns of atoms in a microscope. And it's this type of technology that we need to analyze. And then it becomes a matter of, an issue of scale. If you want to study the ocean, you need huge amounts of samples. But at the same time, to do that in this machinery, you have only very minute sections of what you're looking at. So projecting then the results or projecting the findings onto the bigger, taking the samples is just a challenge. It's just a factorial challenge.
Dilian.
I think it's particularly important for policymakers and businesses to make that distinction because, again, they're the ones holding the responsibility. And I think from what we know about the science, the smaller the plastic pieces are in the ocean, the more likely they are to have a bigger impact because on one hand, yes, they can be eaten by a huge range of animals, but as you know, like nanomaterials pass through membranes, they pass through our bodies, and also their surface to volume ratio means that the way they interact with chemicals in the marine environment, they are basically much more effective at attracting them and holding on to them than bigger pieces of plastic. So when they're eaten, they can be releasing these chemicals.
But microplastics were once big plastics.
Not all of them.
Not
these
all
were
of them.
produced in that form, and these were also produced in that shape.
Both ways. It's
Yes.
sort of top down and bottom.
Yes.
Exactly, and that is valid for all microplastics. Even if they started their life as microplastics, the smaller they are, the bigger that property is to interact with the toxic chemicals in the environment. And I think I also want to go back to the point about what we can communicate. I think, yes, we don't know that these microplastics go into our bodies, and that's not what we're saying. What we're saying is that we know, the science has told us that they go from our toothpaste, they go through wastewater treatment, they go into the environment, and actually there is a Nature paper that identifies microplastics from fish found in the environment. They make the point that they are very likely to come from cosmetic products. So there is that chain in science that, yes, we don't know what the effects are on our bodies, but we do have the environmental impact there, and that's why we already have national legislation on things like microbeads in 6 countries. It's environmental law, it's not human health law, and I think when we communicate that in terms of relatability, I think it's okay to say that this is what we know, and we don't know about the human health impacts, but that has been enough to really drive the environmental legislation.
We do know size matter. We do know size matters, and it makes a difference.
Exactly.
And we need to be aware of it and look at it and act accordingly.
And it makes a difference in terms of prioritizing action, and that's why I think we saw the microbead bans before we saw the single-use plastics directives.
Okay. Sabina, what does psychology tell us about all of this?
I wasn't going to talk as a psychologist again. I was just going to say it's still the most microplastics come from macroplastics. So that's still why we talk about them together. And the second thing I was going to say is I think the evidence is very strong on presence of plastic at all levels in all sorts of compartments and increasing. The evidence is not so strong on harm. I think that's the distinct. Maybe that's why we don't 100% agree. Sorry, but what does psychology tell us? We can build on a large body of research in psychology and the behavioral sciences. We can use visuals in very powerful ways. We can come up with messages that work, that activate people, that engage people, that make them change their behavior. And I think what I would like to see much more is a testing of these messages and these campaigns and these behavior change approaches so that we've got a good evidence base even in the social sciences, because at the moment I don't think that's done enough, and that's a shame because we have very good evaluation methods and it would help us so much to understand what actually makes a difference.
Could I follow up on that one? So I commented that size matters, and I fully agree with Sabina that we know it is there, but we don't know the real consequences across the board, sort of in a widest spread possible way. But the challenge with the microplastics or nanoplastics is their size in terms of analyzing, extracting, understanding what they're actually doing and whether there is harm. There may be risk, but whether there is harm or not. And that's why it's so important to collaborate globally to develop methods, standardization methods to analyze these materials, to make sure that the quality of the science is at the highest possible level and people are not just driving after the next nature impact factor, so high impact factor paper, just producing more and more publications that don't necessarily reveal new knowledge. We need new knowledge by cooperating globally on sort of scientific standards and methodologies that we develop together as a society.
So there you are. Maybe that ALIA ought to have its own journal, which is simply called New Knowledge. Julia.
Just quickly going back on a point I made at the beginning of going back to the source of plastic, because we keep talking about plastic as, it appeared here and what do we do, how do we solve this? But one framing that might help looking at things differently is looking at the whole life cycle, and then the narrative changes, because if we look at the impact or the harm or the hazards that we have in relation to plastics and microplastic, not just from the marine litter perspective, but from the extraction of fossil fuels, there are communities that are living next to where oil or gas are extracted and are affected. And actually in the US, there's an area called Cancer Valley because of the impacts on the population. Then, when there's all the refinery and then the whole production, all these plastics, these plastic additives are added. These are chemicals, and when people then use the product, these chemicals can be released. So there are a lot of studies. If we look at the health part, looking at the chemicals angle, and then of course we have all the impacts of plastic waste, because besides all the landfilling, that is also a visual impact, and that's clear to everyone. If we just say, let's burn all the waste, we have toxic ashes, we have toxic fumes, so there's a bigger story that can be told and should be told because it's still overlooked.
Okay, I'm now going to wrap up this conversation. It's been a good conversation. There's been lots of real importance, I think, that has salience for a lot of other kinds of science that we look at. But what I want you to conclude with each is your thoughts about, because you are absolutely up to your necks, all of you, in this particular area. What one thing do you think you've learnt from microplastics that you would apply to wicked problems in other areas of science affecting society? Nicole.
Could I say? So this is with my personal hat on as a scientist. I would like to also raise the importance of non-results. Because for the microplastics in particular, there's always the search for, oh, are they going to do any harm, and am I going to die any earlier if I'm exposed to these microplastics? So any non-results are as important as the next big paper that is sort of getting everyone's attention and traction in the same way as these images do with the dying turtles. So don't forget the non-results, they are as important.
Diliana.
I think for me, working on microplastics with scientists who have been so devoted on the cause of like driving action, he's really showed me that, you know, plastic is a unique pollutant. That's what I've learned from working on microplastics. And there have been scientists like Richard Thompson and Chelsea Rockman that actually, they take a stand, which is quite rare in the science field. And I see it more and more in the plastics field, because I think plastics pollution research actually drives a lot of emotional response. And I think it's how we deal with these new pollutants that challenge our frameworks of doing policy, of doing science, of doing ecotoxicology research. And that's where this interdisciplinary discussion needs to come in. Actually, we're facing something that doesn't fit the way we've been doing science. And it's understanding where is the balance. We would always need to fill in gaps. And I think that should, you know, science that looks into the harm and risk can be developed in parallel. But also, we need to find the balance of when are we taking the precautionary principle and how do we use that effectively. I think with microplastic, it has worked really well. I think in the US, it was the fastest sailing piece of legislation, the microbeads ban. And if there's something we can learn from that to solve problems effectively while we're closing the gaps in science, I think that's what we should focus on.
Sabina.
As someone who falls into that social science bracket, there are a whole range of different methods that are used in the social sciences, from very qualitative to very quantitative. And me personally, I would like to see much more rigor and quantification of these social factors in this area. That's a bit controversial. There are many social scientists who won't like me saying this, but I think if we want to play at this stage and really make an impact, we've got to go beyond and use the best methods available, up to randomized controlled trials of communications, and that would really help us move forward.
Julia.
Thank you. Also on the social science part and people's behavior, I learned so much how people want to feel good about things. So probably that's also, you know, a blessing and a curse on the plastics and microplastic pollution, because that's why a lot of false solutions that we mentioned before are so popular, because people want to feel that they are contributing to the solution. So on one side, it's very exciting. On the other side, we need to be careful and really monitor what the alternatives are and what's being proposed. But so it's, blessing and a curse. And it seems that it's going so much faster than everything else that probably we will see change soon. That's my hope.
Fantastic. So I promised you a top session. We've had, I think, some great speakers. Please, will you thank them?